Before all of that, Tom Swarbrick and Anushka Asthana are here to discuss today's top headlines. Welcome to both of you.
Good morning.
Hi.
Let's do some breaking news to start. On a lighter note, it's always nice to start on something that's slightly lighter. And the UK Act was announced today on Zoe Ball's Radio 2 breakfast show for Eurovision, and it's May Muller supported Little Mix on tour in 2019. It's called Summertime, empowering a pop anthem about resilience and sisterhood, which is perfect for the occasion. We'll be talking about that a little bit later, but thought you might like to know if you are following, because bearing in mind that the tickets sold out.
Like that.
Wow, that was amazing. There's no way that's possible. Did you rehearse that?
No, we just it happens occasionally.
So if you've been hearing that on the radio, we'll be talking about that a little bit.
It's like when it was on the Eurovision dance move. It was like
but not a very good one. Like a rubbish TikTok.
That's as good as
right,
it gets.
let's get to the other news. And this is Harry and Meghan have adopted royal titles for their children, who will now be called Prince Archie and Princess Lilibet. In a statement released this morning, a spokesperson for Harry and Meghan said the children's titles have been a birthright since their grandfather became monarch. The matter had been settled for some time in alignment with Buckingham Palace.
I just don't... What's the problem? I mean, I see all the outrage about... they can't possibly... It's literally a birthright. He can't divorce himself from who his mum and dad were.
Well, hasn't he sort of... I mean, and I'm quite sympathetic to him in many ways, but hasn't he basically decided to divorce himself by...
Well, he doesn't want to be a working royal. He doesn't want to be a working royal.
So why do you get a title?
Because he was born to the king, and George V said the grandchildren of the sons of the monarch get the titles. And
so
whether he likes it or not, he's the son of the monarch.
I just think he could have had the titles if he'd stayed here and carried on doing his thing. But given that... I mean, I'm not going to lose sleep over it, but given that he got however many £1 million to sell his story on Netflix and write his book...
Yeah.
I think give up the title.
You can choose, though. Princess Anne's children chose not to do it. Well, she chose that for her children. So there is a choice there if you didn't want to.
I think it would have been very churlish of the king to say, no, for this, you know, because of all the Netflix stuff, we're not going to allow you to do something that you should really be able to do because of your birthright. I think that would have been... There are so many bridges being burnt, some by Prince Harry. We don't need more bridges torched in this.
Yes, and so and bearing in mind that at the bottom of all of this is a family. Then in that case you would, and we have enough phone-ins here talking about, you know, trying to build bridges, plaster over wounds. That this has been horrible for them all.
Yeah, I think to that extent it is quite decent. But I guess given how damaged he clearly is from growing up in the way he did, in a way, you'd think he wouldn't want it for his kids, but...
Well, he does.
He does.
Clearly does. Let's talk about Kate Middleton now. Some fantastic pictures of her dressed in a camouflage kit for an engagement in Salisbury Plain training area yesterday. I mean, there is nothing she can't wear, is there? I mean, look at her. She just looks incredible on that road. We all know how cold it was yesterday. She just looks like, you know... all gorgeous. She got involved in the battlefield casualty drill. She was snapped holding a soldier's leg as she was shown how to wrap the wound and check the casualty's vital signs during basic battlefield
Why? Is she going
training.
out there? Is this like a...
No,
she's
she's
heading
not.
out to the front line?
Isn't that what...
She needs to know how to put on a tourniquet or something.
Isn't that what all royals do? I mean, we've had prime ministers standing on tanks in the past.
I think that would be... I mean, imagine if you were unfortunately shot on the front line and someone came medically running over to help you and it was Kate Middleton. That would be absolutely astonishing. I think you'd feel better instantly.
I think she'd know exactly what to do. She seems quite capable to me, don't you think?
Quite capable and, as you say, looks great.
I'd looked out the window and I'd gone, not today.
Yeah, don't fancy it.
Maybe not today. She's like, no, get me there.
Gary Lineker says he will keep speaking up for people with no voice after criticism of his tweets on the government's asylum policy. On Tuesday, the government outlines its plans to ban people arriving in the UK illegally. This is enormously emotive, very controversial, and Gary described on Twitter an immeasurably cruel policy directed at the most vulnerable people in language not dissimilar to that used in Germany in the 1930s.
I mean, it wasn't a great comment to make, and it goes quite far, and I don't think it's particularly helpful to compare things to the 1930s in that way. I do think, like, I'm thinking about this, like, the BBC is quite good at eating itself up. I mean, it was leading the news on this story.
Bizarre.
Rather than
Totally bizarre.
actually the story itself. And I was thinking this, like, I'm a political... You know, I'm the deputy political editor at ITV, right? At ITV News. So it really is my job to be impartial at all times. But if you're a sports presenter, does it matter? I mean,
No.
maybe it does. I'm just thinking about this. I think it's like it doesn't affect what he says about football, does it?
He's not.
It is. Honestly am baffled by how one man's tweet. Yes, he's got a lot of Twitter followers and people know who he is, but he's an ex-footballer who's good at presenting football on the television. How it's dominated the news agenda for 3 days now. I just find it extraordinary that
But you
this is
find
what's
out if there
happening.
are any misdemeanours by anyone who is employed by the BBC, that the first thing many people do is shout and say, I pay your wages. I don't agree with what you're saying, I pay your wages. I mean, it is obviously licence fee based.
Sure.
And so does that have any...
If it's Hugh Edwards saying this, then I think there is an argument to be made here, because he's news, and news you have to be impartial, and you are, I think, as in that role, representative of the BBC, even when you're not on the television.
And not just BBC. I do think that, in that situation, I think that's the same for us, right? It is literally our job to represent our viewers and to give them news in an impartial way. But it's not Gary Lineker's job. And so then I think it's a bit more complicated.
also not a
But
staff
isn't it
member.
everyone's job to have an opinion?
Well, no, but it's definitely not my job to have an opinion.
You are, as you say,
Exactly.
that's your role. If you're a football
So
pundit...
there's literally how many people work for the BBC and none of them allowed to have opinions? Yeah,
Well,
I think they should
I'm
be
allowed
able
to have an opinion on the radio. That's part of the job at LBC is, you know, we're allowed to have opinions, which is quite freeing. I think Gary Lineker is allowed to have opinions. It would be more awkward if he decided to deliver that opinion whilst presenting Match of the Day. That would feel a bit odd. But he's on Twitter, he's not on the television, he's not a BBC employee, and for 3 days the news has been led by the tweet of one man. And actually the news is the substance of the policy
But he is a
itself.
BBC employee.
Well, he's a BBC contractor, isn't he?
Yeah, but he's still employed by the BBC.
Yeah, he's freelance.
I mean, there is a debate to be had about exactly what he said and whether it went too far, right?
I
Which is
agree.
actually
I
slightly
don't actually agree
separate
with him,
to the impartiality point, which is, should he be attacking the policy in that way? And I think you can have a debate about that, and it is interesting. And when I saw the tweet, I was very interested in it.
Is there a possibility here that the government outrage over what's been said is a look over there, don't look over here?
I think it's... I don't think it's a deliberate thing. I don't think, there's a kind of conspiracy around him doing it, but I do think them shouting about Gary Lineker does take up the space where people can look critically at the policy, which is a very controversial policy and has a lot of people who want to talk about it, for example, on legal terms and, on morality terms. We should be having that conversation. And, yes, I think it squeezes the space for that.
It also creates the divide that suggests that if you are in any way opposed or questioning of that policy, that somehow then you must be open borders, let everyone come in. It's just simply not true. And it's an attempt to remove any nuance whatsoever, and it's kind of... I think people can see through it.
Before we go to the break, I just wanted to talk about this one. This has been described as a game-changing weight loss jab. It was approved yesterday for NHS use, and it could help get benefit claimants back to work. So I wanted to bring Dr Zoe in here, because, Zoe, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. There was a drug called Ozempic, which people were buying privately, that they could use, that was a sort of diabetic drug that was being used for weight loss. This isn't the same as that, but it's similar?
It's the same drug, but it's at a different dose. So the drug is called semaglutide. And essentially what it does is, when people are living with obesity, it affects their physiology and their biology so that their brains work more similarly to people who don't have obesity. It essentially helps them suppress their appetite.
And so it would appear, from the information we've got so far, that this is something that you could take for 2 years. It's a 2-year treatment. And what happens at the end of 2 years? You put all the weight back on again?
Well, so this is a drug... In the NHS, it will only be available to certain people who have a BMI above a certain level and also have a medical condition that's linked to obesity. And it will only be available in weight management specialist services, so GPs won't be prescribing it. So it will be a relatively small number of people who will be able to access it. The issue here is that only 50% of the country have these weight management services. So it's still a postcode lottery as to whether you can even be referred to one. So the first thing that needs to happen from a government point of view is we need to make sure that these services are available across the country so that the right people can access it. And it is for 2 years, but that should be alongside psychological support so that people can change their behaviours long term, because otherwise, if you just use the drug and don't do anything else, then once you stop taking it, you know, what will happen is the weight will go back on.
Thanks, Zoe. So as part of the toolkit in the fight against obesity, is this a good thing?
I personally think it's an amazing thing, and if you look at the results for this drug, it does look like a bit of a miracle drug. And I read a really interesting thing about America, where the American Paediatric Association is actually encouraging 12-year-olds to get this drug. Wow. Now, when I saw that, I thought, oh, my gosh, that's crazy. But then when I read about it, it was so interesting, because they were saying we've got to we've got to change the way we think about obesity and see it as a disease, where some people actually, they have different hormones, they are less likely to feel full, they are more likely to feel hungry, and it's not their fault. Yeah. It is actually a disease.
Does that make it OK to be obese as a 12-year-old?
Well, I think what they're saying is it's not OK to be obese, and it doesn't only affect you physically, it affects you being bullied in school, etc. So let's do something about it. Let's give... what they were arguing was, let's give these kids a chance by giving them something that has been shown to be...
To help.
A helpful drug.
Obesity is such a massive problem. And there was a survey last week, I think, Global Obesity Foundation, suggesting that by the end of this decade, more than half of adults in the world will be overweight or obese,
God, yeah.
which is... You know, we have a food problem. Unfortunately, the food problem is less now about access to food, although there is a problem about access to food. It's less about that now. It's about the type of food and the amount of food that people are eating.